rebellion, change, civil disobedience. That's at the heart of this week's Torah portion. So let's waste no time to get to the reading of our Parsha. And since there are a number of different events of great historical importance in these chapters, not enough time to address them all. We're going to focus only on a small part. Time gets gobbled up here. Between the last verse of Genesis and the opening verse of Exodus, as much as 350 years have passed. Let that number sink in for a moment. It's almost as long as it has been since the time the Pilgrims landed on North American shores until now. So a great deal has happened down in Egypt. A lot of changes have occurred. And the first few verses of Exodus are kind of a bridge that connects Genesis with Exodus in order to explain what's happened. Now, it's not as though overnight the Israelites went from freedom and thriving to slavery and deprivation. As with all radical changes in the direction of a nation, it's a slow roll. Even though modern technology and communication seems to have allowed radical changes to happen far more rapidly. Now, Genesis is not the end of one story and Exodus the start of a new one. Exodus is but a continuation and a progression of the redemption history that began in Genesis. So we are reminded that Jacob and all 11 of his sons that lived with him in Canaan, along with their family members, came to live in Egypt. But Joseph was already there. Now, in total, there were originally 70 family members. Yet in reality, that number can only be speaking about those who were genetically connected to Jacob, as opposed to those women who maybe married into the family, number of concubines, no doubt a few slaves or bondservants. My estimation is that likely the number was closer to 200 that made that original journey from Canaan to Egypt. Now, what God, through Joseph, had begun, Joseph's death didn't end. Verse 7 of chapter 1 says that even after Joseph died, the Israelites continued to prosper and grow in number and spread out exceedingly. And this went on for at least 150 years, probably a few more. Yet it was this very purpose of God, this amazing fruitfulness, that was going to lead Israel into an inevitable confrontation with a future Pharaoh, an increasingly paranoid Pharaoh. And while the enviable status of the Hebrews begun by Joseph continued on for many decades and allowed the sons of Israel to grow and prosper, it was also creating this festering jealousy and hatred of them by the native Egyptians. The end of verse 7 marks the end of a prosperous life in Egypt as the Israelites had known it. So as verse 7 ends, verse 8 begins, a new and far less happy era for the Israelites in Egypt emerges. We're told that a new king, that is, a new Pharaoh, arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. This new Egyptian Pharaoh promptly announces that the Israelites, who'd been honorable and worthy citizens of Egypt for so very long, are suddenly seen as a danger to Egypt. And these Hebrews are a danger because they are many more than we are. The Hebrews would bear the brunt of Egypt's newfound nationalism, bigotry, and paranoia. Well, there was yet another long-term effect. After only a few generations of the Hebrews in Egypt, they began to naturally think of themselves as Egyptians, with their particular race having no bearing on their nationality. Not since but a few years after Jacob migrated to Egypt had an Israelite known any other life, any other place than Egypt as their home. But when the line of Pharaoh switched from Semites to ethnic Egyptians, all that changed. Suddenly, even if Israel didn't make any clear distinction between themselves and ethnic Egyptians, the Egyptian kings did, and it became us versus them. And at the same time, it reminded of Israel of just who they are. They were not Egyptian Gentiles. They only lived there. And according to their patriarch Abraham, it would be for a specified length of time. Then it would end with their migration back to Canaan. And as their oppression increased, they realized, once again, they were not Egyptians. They were a separate people that God himself had created and set apart for himself. But even so, don't get the mental picture that the common Egyptian population began taking Hebrews as house slaves. Rather, it was that the Egyptian government conscripted the Israelite males as work gangs for their ambitious building projects. And interestingly, what Egypt also did was to conscript native Egyptian males to create a loyal nationalist military to protect them from invasion. Thus, the Hebrew males became the nation's skilled civilian labor force. There's no evidence that Israelite women were included in this slave labor scheme because the work that was required was male work, making mud bricks, then constructing houses and buildings, maintaining a vast network of canals and water reservoirs, as well as building new roads and military fortresses. We learn that even with the hard labor and oppression that ought to have resulted in a higher death rate and a lower birth rate, the Hebrews' numbers continued to increase. What we see happen is that this inexplicable reality caused Pharaoh to get worried. He was afraid that the Hebrews' numbers had grown so large as to be a threat to Egypt's national security. Now, when I see how many Israelites wound up leaving Egypt, it's my estimate that by the time Moses came into the scene, the Hebrews made up perhaps 25% of Egypt's total population. I mean, that is more than enough to worry a king. So worried and frustrated was this unnamed Pharaoh that he did something desperate, something that in some ways would be counterproductive to his grand purpose. He ordered those who the Bible calls the midwives of the Hebrews to cull the Israelite stock. I mean, the plan was that if the infants they assisted into the world were boys, they were to be immediately killed. Yet, had Pharaoh actually succeeded in this infanticide, he would only have reduced the workforce available for his aggressive construction aspirations. His plan didn't work. These midwives, who knew and feared the Hebrew God, didn't obey the Pharaoh. What we essentially have here is the first recorded instance in the Bible of civil disobedience in order to obey God's morals and ethics, which often are in opposition to men's morals and ethics. I wonder how we believers are to understand this. Yeshua tells us to obey our governments. But just how far are we to take this? I don't think the matter is that complex. We should obey our government even when some of the actions seem grossly unfair. However, never should we obey our government when it crosses the line of morality. And we are asked to do something that is against God's moral code as given to us in his word. So this rather brave defiance against Pharaoh's order of death to newborn Hebrew baby boys was conducted primarily by women. Two women are named here as the midwives, Shifrah and Pu'ah. And without doubt, they must have been something like the senior midwives, in charge of many more midwives, because two would never have been enough to handle the hundreds of daily births taking place among the Israelites all over Egypt. So the book of Exodus starts with what seems like really good news. Verse 7, the descendants of Israel were fruitful, increased abundantly, multiplied, and grew very powerful. The land became filled with them. But something changes drastically and catastrophically for Jacob's now very large family. Around 2 centuries passed since Joseph arrived, when this different Pharaoh had come into power, who we're told doesn't know Joseph. This means who Joseph is, what he did, how he governed, is a thing of the distant past. We have a fundamental change in political thought and agenda. The Pharaoh of our story came well after the first of the new line of pharaohs that cared not for Joseph's role and direction. What we immediately learn is there's nothing new under the sun. Regimes and governments come and go, they evolve. Our world is an inherently unstable place. Revolutions happen, as with the formation of the United States of America, as we know it today. Virtually every nation in Europe was born out of kingdoms fighting one another, civil wars, uprisings. Communist Russia and China are products of not just one, but of several revolutions and regime changes. Egypt was at one time full of Semite tribes and nations that had moved from both Europe and Asia. One of the largest groups to make their homes there was the Hyksos. There's little doubt that the Pharaoh who was in power when Joseph arrived was not an Egyptian. He was a Semite. And the Hyksos came mainly from Asia, and they began ruling Egypt during the 15th dynasty, around 1500 to 1600 BC. A couple of hundred years after Joseph, they were deposed by a new dynasty of Egyptians that had risen up against the Hyksos rulers. Well, in this Torah reading from Exodus chapter 1 to chapter 6, we find there is much focus on women. In our previous Torah portion, I spoke quite a bit to men. This time I'd like to speak to our women. There are 5 named women we find in these passages who are underappreciated in most Bible studies. The first that we run into are the midwives, Shifrah and Pu'ah. Now, it's entirely possible, even likely, that they were Hyksos and neither truly Egyptian nor Hebrew. And they would have harbored much sympathy for the Hebrews, as their ancient ancestry was connected. Now, these 2 women were assigned the job to drown every male child of the Hebrews in the Nile at the moment of their birth. They must have been recommended to Pharaoh, deemed loyal and trustworthy. But despite their agreement to do so, they didn't obey the ruler of Egypt. Instead, they took a terribly dangerous risk to save the condemned Hebrew male babies. They were courageous and they were moral. And one must conclude that to some measure they must have been aware of and respected the God of the Hebrews more than they feared the Pharaoh and his God. Well, the next woman to be highlighted in this story was exceptionally brave and was the wife of Amram, a Levite. This family of Moses was from the tribe that was destined to become the priests of Israel. The infant Moses was hidden by his family from the Egyptian guards in charge of making sure no Hebrew male babies survived. And miraculously, he remained safe and hidden for 3 months. Now, Moses' mother and father took the chance to hide this baby, preserving his life, but this situation had now become too dangerous for the remainder of the family. Their only reasonable choice was that the baby had to be separated and put into the hands of God. Yocheved, the baby's mother, decided to put the fate of her child into the hands of the creator of the world, and so put her infant in a waterproofed basket, set it into the Nile River. Now, Moses' mother and father had faith in God that whatever the child's fate, it was indeed going to be a matter of God's will. Well, their faith was rewarded. The waterproof basket bobs and floats downstream a short distance, staying near the shoreline. No one knows what's going to happen to this baby. At the same time, a princess of Egypt, the daughter of Pharaoh himself, goes down to the river to bathe, accompanied by her handmaids. Exodus 2, 5 through 10. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the river while her maids and attendants walked along the riverside. And spotting the basket among the reeds, she sent her slave girl to get it. She opened it, looked inside. There in front of her was a crying baby boy, moved with pity. She said, well, this must be one of the Hebrew children. And at this point, his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, would you like me to go and find you one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? Pharaoh's daughter answered, yes, go. So the girl went, called the baby's own mother. Pharaoh's daughter told her, take this child away, nurse it for me. I'll pay you for doing it. So the woman took the child, nursed it. Then when the child had grown some, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter. And she began to raise him as her son. And she called him Moshe, explaining, because I pulled him out of the water. Now, there are some interesting things that happen here that can just fly right by us. Pharaoh's daughter wades into the water of the Nile alone. Her handmaids don't go with her into the water, as would have seemed customary. I mean, the Nile River, one of the greatest rivers of the world, teems with fish, crocodiles, venomous water snakes, and a few other critters that can be most dangerous. Logic says that if Pharaoh's daughter was going to bathe in the river, it would have been natural for her handmaids to enter the water with her, to be on watch for those dangerous animals, and to warn her, even protect her from them. Now, the Jewish rabbis of old concluded from this that Pharaoh's daughter was already attracted to the faith of Israel, some believing that she had taken up some of its ways. And so it happened that she was, at that time of her monthly cycle, she went to the river to wash ceremonially, as was her conviction borrowed from the Hebrews. This would account for her entering this dangerous water alone. Another tidbit of information that seems only to strengthen this rabbinical commentary is that when Pharaoh's daughter opens the basket, looks at the baby Moses, she immediately identifies this child as Hebrew. I mean, how would this daughter of the greatest king in the world at that time, who lives in one of the most luxurious palaces of the world, with guards and maids, know a Hebrew child from any other, except to know him by his physical appearance, that he couldn't have been an Egyptian? Pharaoh's daughter had to have had some relationship, some knowledge of this nation of slaves that worked on her father's infrastructure projects as Egypt's primary labor force. Now, if Pharaoh's daughter's intent was loyalty to her father's edicts and to the laws of Egypt, as one would have expected to be the case, she would never have rescued and then claimed this obviously Hebrew baby boy for herself. Well, the final heroine of this story is Miriam, the older sister of this baby in the basket. She's hiding by the river at the behest of her worried mother, and without doubt, hoping something like this might happen. Miriam's considered a prophetess in the Bible, and she very likely had a word from God that indeed he will take care of this baby in the basket. So just as soon as Miriam sees Pharaoh's daughter pick up that basket, Miriam appears from behind the vegetation on the riverbanks and comes to talk to the Pharaoh's daughter. She suggests a Hebrew woman to take the baby as a wet nurse, raise him until it's time to deliver the child to Pharaoh's daughter. See, all of these women play important roles in saving the life of baby Moses. But which one might be the most important woman of the bunch? My vote goes to Pharaoh's daughter. Without her doing the improbable, saving that anonymous Hebrew baby, giving it an Egyptian name, Moses, history would have been drastically altered from how it turned out. It's rather ironic that this Egyptian princess saves the Savior that is going to one day lead Israel out of its slavery and into freedom. A man that would personally receive the Torah from God, mold the Hebrews into a great and cohesive people group. If Pharaoh's daughter hadn't saved Moses, there would be no Israel, no King David, no Yeshua. And when we read of the Bible prophets, we always seem to find that God puts Egypt into a category all their own. Yes, they are Gentiles. Yes, they oppressed Israel. Even in modern times, Egypt has attacked and harmed Israel. But on the other hand, God seems to do something unique with Egypt as they receive their own customized and differentiated future from the rest of the nations. Egypt was where Israel was rescued and delivered. But before that, it was where Jacob's clan was welcomed, cared for, so much more. It was where Yeshua's parents would take him to be safeguarded from Israel's own wicked king of that time, Herod. Such is how it was and how it is in this world. The same world we still live in, unlikely actions by the least suspected people and nations take place in isolated circumstances, but leave enormous marks on history. Were any of the participants aware of what Moses would become and do? Of course not. Each played their small role led by God without having any idea what the others were doing. And all this without knowing the long-range ramifications. This is why I'm always advising you to say yes to God as the right and wise thing to do. His plans are far beyond human complexities, far beyond the control or view of mere humans. Now, we already spoke of civil disobedience, but I'd like to end today's Torah portion with this subject left burned into our minds to highlight the rightness of civil disobedience, if necessary, to obey God, versus the rightness of blindly following our government authorities because it's deemed legal. I want to bring up this well-known passage in order to clarify the point. Matthew 7:21-23. Not everyone that says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. Only those who do what my Father in heaven wants. On that day, many will say to me, Lord, Lord, didn't we prophesy in your name? Didn't we expel demons in your name? Didn't we perform many miracles in your name? And I'm going to tell them to their faces, I never knew you. Get away from me, you workers of lawlessness. See, Yeshua brings up this issue of lawlessness. How can anyone who obeys their government be seen as lawless before Yeshua and his Father? I mean, is Yeshua speaking against civil disobedience as being lawless, even when it comes to the refusal of doing the immoral? I cannot help but think of Corrie ten Boom, one heroine among many in World War II who hid Jews from the Nazis, risking their own lives. She operated directly against her government's laws. And so, regularly lied to German soldiers who came to her asking if she knew of any Jews in hiding. Was she, who Yeshua was condemning as being lawless? See, the Bible only ever talks about the matter of law and lawlessness in terms of God's laws. The law of Moses, never human laws and edicts. Today, in January of 2026, Israel remains in a perpetual fight for its right to exist. The criminal terror group Hamas, as the chosen representative government of the people of Gaza, attacked Israel, but Israel's determination to fight back is seen as making Israel the aggressor. Is Israel doing something immoral in attempting to destroy Hamas? Well, by the standard of those nations who hate Israel, by the international laws of the world, yes. But according to God's standards, no. So I want to leave you today with this thought. You must all be prepared to face the consequences if we are forced into making a hard choice between God's laws and those laws that come from human minds. While our eternal reward may be great for obeying God, we must soberly understand that our temporal reward may amount to punishment. Pu'ah and Shifrah were well aware they were putting their lives on the line for their decision to be civilly disobedient to the Pharaoh, all the while claiming a loyalty to him that was false. But they did it because they feared God more. That's our model for decisions and behavior in this dying and corrupted world, where we're going to have to weigh sins and determine which are the lesser and which are the greater, because we must understand the conundrum that sometimes acquiring sin to be moral before God is inescapable. That's one of several reasons we so desperately need a Savior.
For more teachings and information, visit us online today. Come and be a part of our fellowship here at The Seed. Enjoy worshiping and learning God's Word with us.